Section 56 of A Popular History of France, Volume 5. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 5, by François Guizot, translated by Robert Black. CHAPTER XLVI. Louis XIV. And Home Administration. Part I. It is King Louis XIV.'s distinction, and heavy burden in the eyes of history, that it is impossible to tell of anything in his reign without constantly recurring to himself. He had two ministers of the higher order, Colbert and Louvois, several of good capacity, such as Seignelay and Torcy; others incompetent, like Chamillard. He remained as much master of the administrators of the first rank as if they had been insignificant clerks. The home government of France, from 1661 to 1715, is summed up in the king's relations with his ministers. "I resolved from the first not to have any premier minister," says Louis XIV. In his Memoires, "and not to leave to another the functions of king whilst I had nothing but the title; but, on the contrary, I made up my mind to share the execution of my orders amongst several persons, in order to concentrate their authority in mine alone. I might have cast my eyes upon people of higher consideration than those I selected, but they seemed to me competent to execute, under me, the matters with which I purposed to entrust them. I did not think it was to my interest to look for men of higher standing, because, as I wanted above all things to establish my own reputation, it was important that the public should know, from the rank of those of whom I made use, that I had no intention of sharing my authority with them, and that they themselves, knowing what they were, should not conceive higher hopes than I wished to give them." It has been said already that the court governed France in the reign of Louis XIV., and what was, in fact, the court? The men who lived about the king, depending on his favor, the source or arbiter of their fortunes. The great lords served in the army, with lustre, when they bore the name of Conde, Turenne, or Luxembourg; but they never had any place amongst the king's confidential servants. "Luck, in spite of us, has as much to do as wisdom, and more, with the choice of our ministers," he says in his Memoires; "and, in respect of what wisdom may have to do therewith, genius is far more effectual than counsel." It was their genius which made the fortunes and the power of Louis XIV.'s two great ministers, Colbert and Louvois. In advance, and on the faith of Cardinal Mazarin, the king knew the worth of Colbert. "I had all possible confidence in him," says he, "because I knew that he had a great deal of application, intelligence, and probity." Rough, reserved, taciturn, indefatigable in work, passionately devoted to the cause of order, public welfare, and the peaceable aggrandizement of France, Colbert, on becoming the comptroller of finance in 1661, brought to the service of the state superior views, consummate experience, and indomitable perseverance. The position of affairs required no fewer virtues. "Disorder reigned everywhere," says the king. "On casting over the various portions of my kingdom not eyes of indifference but the eyes of a master, I was sensibly affected not to see a single one which did not deserve and did not press to be taken in hand. The destitution of the lower orders was extreme, and the finances, which give movement and activity to all this great framework of the monarchy, were entirely exhausted, and in such plight that there was scarcely any resource to be seen. The affluent, to be seen only amongst official people, on the one hand, cloaked all their malversations by divers kinds of artifices, and uncloaked them on the other by their insolent and audacious extravagance, as if they were afraid to leave me in ignorance of them." The punishment of the tax collectors (traitants), prosecuted at the same time as Superintendent Fouquet, the arbitrary redemption of rentes (annuities) on the city of Paris or on certain branches of the taxes, did not suffice to alleviate the extreme suffering of the people. The talliages from which the nobility and the clergy were nearly everywhere exempt pressed upon the people with the most cruel inequality. "The poor are reduced to eating grass and roots in our meadows like cattle," said a letter from Blaisois; "those who can find dead carcasses devour them; and, unless God have pity upon them, they will soon be eating one another." Normandy, generally so prosperous, was reduced to the uttermost distress. "The great number of poor has exhausted charity and the power of those who were accustomed to relieve them," says a letter to Colbert from the superintendent of Caen. In 1662 the town was obliged to throw open the doors of the great hospital, having no longer any means of furnishing subsistence to those who were in it. I can assure you that there are persons in this town who have gone for whole days without anything to eat. The country, which ought to supply bread for the towns, is crying for mercy's sake to be supplied therewith itself." The peasants, wasted with hunger, could no longer till their fields; their cattle had been seized for taxes. Colbert proposed to the king to remit the arrears of talliages, and devoted all his efforts to reducing them whilst regulating their collection. His desire was to arrive at the establishment everywhere of real talliages, on landed property, etc., instead of personal talliages, variable imposts, depending upon the supposed means or social position of the inhabitants. He was only very partially successful, without, however, allowing himself to be repelled by the difficulties presented by differences of legislation and customs in the provinces. "Perhaps," he wrote to the superintendent of Aix in 1681, "on getting to the bottom of the matter and considering it in detail, you will not discover in it all the impossibilities you have pictured to yourself." Colbert died without having completed his work. The talliages, however, had been reduced by 8 millions of livres within the first 2 years of his administration. "All the imposts of the kingdom," he writes, in 1662, to the superintendent of Tours, who is complaining of the destitution of the people, "are, as regards the talliages, but about 37 millions, and for 40 or 50 years past they have always been between 40 and 50 millions, except after the peace, when his Majesty reduced them to 32, 33, and 34 millions." Peace was of short duration in the reign of Louis XIV., and often so precarious that it did not permit of disarmament. At the very period when the able minister was trying to make the people feel the importance of the diminution in the talliages, he wrote to the king, "I entreat your Majesty to read these few lines attentively. I confess to your Majesty that, the last time you were graciously pleased to speak to me about the state of the finances, my respect, the boundless desire I have always had to please you and serve you to your satisfaction, without making any difficulty or causing any hitch, and still more your natural eloquence which succeeds in bringing conviction of whatever you please, deprived me of courage to insist and dwell somewhat upon the condition of your finances, for the which I see no other remedy but increase of receipts and decrease of expenses. Wherefore, though this is no concern at all of mine, I merely entreat your Majesty to permit me to say that in war as well as in peace you have never consulted your finances for the purpose of determining your expenditure, which is a thing so extraordinary that assuredly there is no example thereof. For the past 20 years during which I have had the honor of serving your Majesty, though the receipts have greatly increased, you would find that the expenses have much exceeded the receipts, which might perhaps induce you to moderate and retrench such as are excessive. I am aware, sir, that the figure I present herein is not an agreeable one; but in your Majesty's service there are different functions; some entail nothing but agreeables whereof the expenses are the foundation; that with which your Majesty honors me entails this misfortune, that it can with difficulty produce anything agreeable, since the proposals for expenses have no limit, but one must console oneself by constantly laboring to do one's best." Louis XIV. Did not "moderate or retrench his expenses." Colbert labored to increase the receipts. The new imposts excited insurrections in Angoumois, in Guienne, and Brittany. Bordeaux rose in 1695 with shouts of "Hurrah for the king without gable!" Marshal d'Albret ventured into the streets in the district of St. Michel; he was accosted by one of the ringleaders. "Well, my friend," said the marshal, "with whom is thy business? Dost wish to speak to me?" "Yes," replied the townsman, "I am deputed by the people of St. Michel to tell you that they are good servants of the king, but that they do not mean to have any gabel, or marks on pewter or tobacco, or stamped papers, or irref d'arbitrage (arbitration clerk's fee)." It was not until a year afterwards that the taxes could be established in Gascony. Troops had to be sent to Rennes to impose the stamp tax upon the Bretons. "Soldiers are more likely to be wanted in Lower Brittany than in any other spot," said a letter to Colbert from the lieutenant general, M. de Lavardin. "It is a rough and wild country, which breeds inhabitants who resemble it. They understand French but slightly, and reason not much better. The Parliament is at the back of all this." Riots were frequent, and were put down with great severity. "The poor Low Bretons collect by 40 or 50 in the fields," writes Madame de Sevigne on the 24th of September, 1675; "as soon as they see soldiers, they throw themselves on their knees, saying, 'Mea culpa,' all the French they know." "The severities are abating," she adds on the 3d of November; "after the hangings there will be no more hanging." All these fresh imposts, which had cost so much suffering and severity, brought in but 2,500,000 livres at Colbert's death. The indirect taxes, which were at that time called fermes generales (farmings general), amounted to 37 millions during the first 2 years of Colbert's administration, and rose to 64 millions at the time of his death. "I should be apprehensive of going too far, and that the prodigious augmentations of the fermes (farmings) would be very burdensome to the people," wrote Louis XIV. in 1680. The expenses of recovering the taxes, which had but lately led to great abuses, were diminished by half. "The bailiffs generally, and especially those who are set over the recovery of talliages, are such terrible brutes, that, by way of exterminating a good number of these, you could not do anything more worthy of you than suppress those," wrote Colbert to the criminal magistrate of Orleans. "I am at this moment promoting 2 suits against the collectors of talliages, in which I expect at present to get 10,000 crowns damages, without counting another against an assessor's officer, who wounded one Grimaud, the which had one of his daughters killed before his eyes, his wife, another of his daughters, and his female servant wounded with swords and sticks, the writ of distrainment being executed whilst the poor creature was being buried." The bailiffs were suppressed, and the king's justice was let loose not only against the fiscal officers who abused their power, but also against tyrannical nobles. Masters of requests and members of the Parliament of Paris went to Auvergne and Velay and held temporary courts of justice, which were called grands jours. Several lords were found guilty. Sieur de la Motte actually died upon the scaffold for having unjustly despoiled and maltreated the people on his estates. "He was not one of the worst," says Flechier in his Journal des Grands Jours d'Auvergne. The Duke of Bouillon, governor of the province, had too long favored the guilty. "I resolved," says the king in his Memoires, "to prevent the people from being subjected to thousands and thousands of tyrants, instead of one lawful king, whose indulgence alone it is that causes all this disorder." The puissance of the provincial governors, already curtailed by Richelieu, suffered from fresh attacks under Louis XIV. Everywhere the power passed into the hands of the superintendents, themselves subjected in their turn to inspection by the masters of requests. "Acting on the information I had that in many provinces the people were plagued by certain folks who abused their title of governors in order to make unjust requisitions," says the king in his Memoires, "I posted men in all quarters for the express purpose of keeping myself more surely informed of such exactions, in order to punish them as they deserved." Order was restored in all parts of France. "The Auvergnats," said a letter to Colbert from President de Novion, "never knew so certainly that they had a king as they do now." "A useless banquet at a cost of 1,000 crowns causes me incredible pain," said Colbert to Louis XIV., "and yet, when it is a question of millions of gold for Poland, I would sell all my property, I would pawn my wife and children, and I would go afoot all my life to provide for it, if necessary. Your Majesty, if it please you, you will forgive me this little transport. I begin to doubt whether the liberty I take is agreeable to your Majesty. It has seemed to me that you were beginning to prefer your pleasures and your diversions to everything else. At the very time when your Majesty told me at St. Germain that the morsel must be taken from one's mouth to provide for the increment of the naval armament, you spent 200,000 livres down for a trip to Versailles, to wit, 13,000 pistoles for your gambling expenses and the queen's, and 50,000 livres for extraordinary banquets. You have likewise so intermingled our diversions with the war on land that it is difficult to separate the two, and if your Majesty will be graciously pleased to examine in detail the amount of useless expenditure you have incurred, you will plainly see that if it were all deducted, you would not be reduced to your present necessity. The right thing to do, sir, is to grudge 5 sous for unnecessary things, and to throw millions about when it is for your glory." Section 56.